Robert, let's just start with the January 6th. Everybody wants to know, do we know how many, are there people still in detention, being detained? Are they still in jail? Do we know how many, and do we know what is going on with them?
At least 30 to my knowledge. So that, and their treatment continues to get worse. And when there's adverse public coverage about the issue, so I believe Julie Kelly went on the 11 radio show, and not long after that, they were facing more retaliatory action from the people from whatever facilities they're in. Technically, they're in the marshal's custody, but the marshals don't maintain the facilities themselves. So they're either usually it's the Bureau of Prisons maintaining it, or sometimes it's a local jail, depending on where they're at. But to my knowledge, they're all in different federal facilities at this point, many of them facing solitary confinement, many of them facing various forms of physical assault on a regular basis. Many of them have been there now for months and months with very little justification, in my view, for it. And we see the legal establishment, both the left and the right, making excuses for it. The president of Russia and the foreign ambassador to the United States from Russia both highlighted how bad this treatment is as a way to counteract criticism of Russia. They're like, you can say whatever you want about us, but we aren't doing this to our people. You are. And so it should be internationally embarrassing more than it is, but the media generally doesn't cover it. And you have some pitiful apologists going on in the bail context about the indictments of the attacks on Tucker Carlson and Darren Beatty this week. That a lot of it was rooted in nonsense, and a lot of it's from the same people that gaslit Trump supporters about what Durham and Barr were going to do, that gaslit Trump supporters about who and what Amy Coney Barrett was going to be. We'll get to that later in the show, that it's now becoming crystal clear who she's going to be. And some of us predicted it, some of us didn't. But as one example, there's this guy that claims to be a big defense lawyer. I have no idea who he is, and he hides behind an anonymous name called Shipwrecked Crew. I'll give him credit. I think that's a well-titled name, because if you are on his ship, you will end up wrecked. He was one of the big defenders of Amy Coney Barrett, attacked me personally because I said that Barrett was not going to be this great defender, Trumpian populist type defender on elections or anything else. But he was actually trying to tell people that bail is run by pretrial services officers that work for the court, and prosecutors have almost no role but to sit there. That's just a flat out lie. So when people like that are just making up stuff like that, then you get a sense of there's a great desire. It's so embarrassing for the legal establishment what Darren Beatty and Tucker Carlson and Julie Kelly, Rights for the American Greatness, Lee Smith, and others and Dinesh D'Souza are highlighting about this case, that they're going to great lengths to cover for them, make up legal doctrines that don't exist. They often approach it from a sort of snobbish perspective, and they're usually dead wrong about the law.
So, yeah, Shipwrecked Crew has a decent following, 48,000 or 47,000 on Twitter. And he said a few things. So I think we're going to get to another one that is untenable in and of itself. But the people being detained right now, what by and large, what charges are they being detained on? Is this trespass or more? Yeah, sorry.
Almost all minor offenses. So sometimes conspiracy arguments. And it's some of those conspiracy indictments that triggered the curiosity of Darren Beatty and Tucker Carlson and others this week, in a story that sort of went around the world because of its explosive insights and potential consequences. So we'll see how that goes. But that isn't the CIA inducing it, I swear. But the whole nature of the system is sort of being exposed. But a lot of these people, pretty minor charges. So they may be felony charges, but they're still minor charges. And the basis isn't consistent either with the Eighth Amendment, in my view, or the Bail Reform Act, which I've never considered constitutional in the first place. 4 Supreme Court justices originally agreed with me. Unfortunately, it was just 4. But the Bail Reform Act of 1984 effectively, in my view, undermined what the Constitution was supposed to require. Because there's no evidence that these people are a flight risk. There's no evidence that these people are such a risk that there's no means of pretrial detention other than actually detaining them, pretrial conditions of release that will secure their appearance at trial. They could have fled, and none of them did. And then none of them are accused of the kind of crimes, particularly violent crimes, gang-related crimes, certain drug crimes, that can warrant pretrial detention, in my view. So
it's nuts because we're seeing some of the stories. I mean, it's coming out of New York that has had the bail reform and the judge's hands are tied, but they literally release violent offenders who go on to commit violent offenses. Here in Washington, regardless of what you think of the January 6th riots, even if you think it's an insurrection, we've seen what some of these people were arrested for and detained for, and it's not insurrectionism. I mean, it can hardly even be called violence for a lot of them who have been detained. And for everybody who, like we've said multiple times here, like everybody who says the system should release people, reform, rehabilitate, yada yada yada, and now you've detained people, and effectively you may not have ruined their lives, but you definitely ruined their year because you can't keep a job while you're in jail. And these are not things that should have kept people in jail to begin with. And now we're seeing some of these written statements that they're being compelled or advised to produce in order to beg for forgiveness. For anybody who doesn't know, there were two, I don't remember the names of the two individuals, but one is literally a grandmother. Like Robert's been saying, they're locking up nannies and yada, yada, yada. It's not an exaggeration. This woman is literally a grandmother. I think she has 5 grandkids, 2 kids, 49 years old, never had an issue in her life. Has to write, her lawyer drafted a 3-page. It's beyond a groveling mea culpa. It's
a re-education camp.
It is the scene from 1984, just, with less violence. It's, you will say this, you will grovel, you will break yourself so that the system can reshape you, and you will apologize and you will say that you love us. And it reads that way. And then she's watched 3 movies to rehabilitate herself. Schindler's List and a couple others.
Yeah, you give people. I mean, basically a liberal reading list, a liberal film list, a liberal of complete confession, and a confession that's way beyond the alleged crime. It's really what that is saying is that her crime was being a Trump supporter. Her crime was having populist beliefs. That's what that really exposed. I've never seen a sentencing memorandum like that in my life, where basically a defense lawyer felt the only chance she had to avoid jail for a very minor offenses. I think in her case, all misdemeanors, that, no violence of any kind whatsoever, no conspiratorial objective, basically just walked into the Capitol, probably had good trial defenses, but is, not someone who has the means to defend herself meaningfully, was basically had to go through, hey, tell us the Orwellian camp you went through and your self-education that you went through, and maybe we won't whack you across the head.
And I don't play the identity card. I don't think anyone has ever heard me play the as a blank, and I'm not doing it now. I'm just saying that list is offensive because, and again, I always say, nobody cares if you're offended. It doesn't matter. I'm just saying, I'm telling you, it's offensive. The idea that the prosecutor and the system is trying to equate what happened on January 6th to 3 of the, how do you measure atrocities, to the Holocaust, to the 2 other ones had to do with Native American treatment in the United States. The idea, if I were a member of any of these groups, I would find it offensive that they are trying to cheapen, exploit those tragedies by equating the January 6th riots, which we know 6 people died from, or 5, all but one of them of medical emergencies. Sicknick was the last holdout that we got confirmation on, and the only one who was killed by the police and not by the other rioters. Yes, some police were roughed up, and there were some incidents, as there are pretty much in every riot. But the idea that in this memorandum they would equate January 6th to 3 of the greatest atrocities of all time, among the 3 of the greatest, it's offensive on a spiritual level. It is just idiotic on a practical level. And they make her do it. Her charge was no violence, no damage, no nothing, just accessing the property. And you're right, Robert. It reads like they're trying to shame Trump supporters for being Trump supporters by labeling them all as domestic T words by virtue of the fact that they went into this building, some of them not even knowing that they weren't allowed.
Precisely. And so that's where, the political nature of this is important to understand for the big controversy that broke out this week, which was Darren Beatty of Revolver News, who was a former Trump administration appointee, wrote a piece that just laid out, all he did was follow the indictments themselves and what the grand jury alleged. And he pointed out that the people identified as the most culpable, the leaders, the instigators of the conspiracy, are strangely missing from being identified or indicted. And so his point is like, how is it you have all these people who are clearly the key instigators behind the worst alleged acts not be indicted, not even be identified? And so that was step one. And he's mostly asked the question. He said, now you can look to history for a possible answer. If you look at the Chicago 7 trial, which is probably the most analogous trial, people should study it because the biggest one where people were blamed for politicized reasons concerning an alleged riotous set of events. And that's relating to the Chicago Democratic National Convention, 1968. Many films, many documentaries out there on it because it's the left. So the left actually pays attention, unlike they're doing to this case. And or you can look at how they infiltrated labor unions to instigate events, how they read Operation Northwoods to understand how the Joint Chiefs of Staff try to convince the president to stage events. Or you look at just everyday infiltration that's taken place with COINTELPRO. You can look at whether things went AWOL. You'd have to go to see a hush at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. By the way, great late Father's Day gift for anybody out there. Get them a subscription to vivabarneslaw.locals.com because it's the gift that gives back. And to look at whether Oklahoma City may have implications on this accord. But at a minimum, there has been extensive documentation on what in the post 9/11 terrorism cases that almost every one of them was led, instigated, and created by a Fed. 95% of them. Because I remember watching some of these indictments and I was like, this doesn't fit like some hardcore terror cell. They didn't infiltrate a terror cell. They found some nitwit kids that can make themselves look like heroes. He mentioned that, and then Beatty also mentioned the recent Governor Whitmer case that we spotted from the get-go as a potential high-risk entrapment case. And of course, more and more evidence is coming out that the main instigator was an informant and an infiltrator in a government asset. And so he said, what if the reason they're not identifying these culpable people, that they're not indicting these culpable people, is that they were actually on the government payroll or government assets in one way, shape, or form? This Tucker Carlson covered it, and this struck such a nerve that all of a sudden the entire legal establishment of both the left and the right, so the usual suspects of the National Review, the usual suspects of the shipwreck crews of the world, these people came rushing in to say, no, that's not even possible, because if you're a government informant, you can't possibly be a criminal co-conspirator. Now, there's several problems with their claims. Problem number one is, then why is there, if an informant cannot be an unindicted co-conspirator, why is there more than a decade of case law, particularly from the Eastern District of Wisconsin where I practice, where they say the government can hide the identity of an unindicted co-conspirator under the informer's privilege? And the informer's privilege, for people that don't know it, is the government has a privilege to hide the identity of an individual who is an informant. It takes extraordinary levels of begging and screaming and whining and yelling and proving in order to get a judge to ever divulge that information. I've been through massive battles on that. So their explanation makes no sense. How is it Andrew McCarthy and Nash saying this is not even possible? How is Shipwreck Crew saying this is not even possible if that case law exists? But that's only one example. Second example, famous mob case in New York, where the problem was the key witness in the case was an informant, government informant. And what did the Second Circuit Court of Appeals say back in 2001, so 20 years ago? They said you can absolutely be a criminal co-conspirator, an unindicted co-conspirator, and be an informant. So these people are out there making statements that are blatantly false about the law. What they're talking about is that it's, of course, illegal for the government to be doing some of this activity, but that's sort of like a circular argument. Their argument is the government can't have done any illegal activity because it's illegal for the government to do that activity. And the history would say that they're full of it. And so the actual law is they could absolutely, Darren Beatty and Tucker Carlson may have stumbled across one method, one means of proving government culpability and complicity in this. Now, there's a bunch of other ways, too. You could have government, and just think about it. If you have a government informant, what's the probabilities they just sit there and listen? The way you become a successful infiltrator and informant is you inspire the ideas. And this has been almost always the case with government informants.
There's my first reflex now, and call it conspiracy, whatever. It's more just living experience. The more the media and the same players, like you say, it reflexively come out and staunchly and violently oppose certain suggestions, much like they did a year ago with the idea that Jon Stewart, what he said recently, might have been the case. And then a year later, you find out. So I don't know how many times someone with a memory, longer than a goldfish will have to live this before they start noticing a pattern. I've noticed the pattern and I can't unsee it. So when I see people reacting like this, and this is not like, this is less outlandish even than the initial claims of where the virus came from. This is, everybody knows. It's happened time and time again that the FBI, it always becomes a question. Are the FBI informants catching a crime, or are they causing a crime? Are they catching a criminal, or are they, what's the word, entrapping what would otherwise be somebody who might be easily influenced? And we've seen them do it time and time again. So the idea that anyone comes out today and says, no, government now is totally different than it's ever been in the history of government kind, I'm suspicious. And we saw it with Whitmer. I'm not just suspicious. I think it's probably more likely than not, but we'll see. But so there were in all of these indictments, just clarify this for people out there who may not understand, they're referring to the indicted and what we call unindicted co-conspirators who are not named in the pleadings or in the indictment themselves, but seemingly participated in the event. It's
beyond that. They're the most culpable. And that's what Beatty said. This seems really odd. How is it? So here's some of this is my favorite excuse so far. Andy McCarthy's excuse and some other people's excuse is, well, what must have happened is these after it happened, these people felt so bad they ran down to the FBI and confessed quickly and got a sweetheart deal. The probabilities of that are next to nil. So now sometimes they will try to cover for a informant, because I've dealt with this in almost every major conspiracy case I have ever had. The government has hid their informants amongst unindicted co-conspirators. I've experienced this for 20 years. Many of these other lawyers talking, to my knowledge, Andy McCarthy, how many criminal defense cases I've ever known him to win? Big fat zero. Most of these people are former feds covering for feds. So Shipwreck Crew claims to be this big lawyer. Why do you got to hide behind anonymity then, pal? Just come on out for the rest of us. Let's see who you are.
Especially given the side on which he's arguing is not typically the side that gets the wrath of social media. I just pulled up this Operation Northwoods. For anybody who doesn't know, look it up. It's going to blow your mind. The only distinction between that is that never materialized. So people say, yeah, sure, they tried to plot it, but it got stopped. So you can trust the Department of Justice or Department of Defense. Anybody who doesn't know, check out Joe Rogan's on it. It's amazing, but look it up. It's earth-shattering. But yes, sorry, carry on, Robert.
Yeah, so that explanation makes I've experienced it repeatedly, experienced it often. Just think about it if you're the government's perspective. You have an informant. You have an informant who helped lead the You need the facts that he has provided. You know the other defendants will know of this informant. So one way you handle it is you just don't indict him. You identify him as an unindicted co-conspirator to continue to mask his role as an informant, because you're not supposed to have informants as co-conspirators by definition. But that doesn't stop them from doing it, and they've done it repeatedly. They did it in the Chicago 7 case. The later joke about the Chicago 7 case was that there were 7 private individuals and 10,000 undercover agents, because there are that many undercover agents all over the place. And folks out there, remember Chicago. This is Chicago 1968. When they're going to go in and assassinate Fred Hampton and then lie about it. It doesn't get exposed, the Black Panther leader of Chicago, until about 11 years later in a trial that takes place in the late 70s in full. The Malcolm X would be assassinated with the key aid and assistance of a federal informant that was working for the NYPD as well. That's a future Hush Hush episode. So this is common MO, common modus operandi. What is not common is that you would have a whole bunch of the leaders of the conspiracy run over to the feds, suddenly confess their crimes, and the feds give them complete immunity from prosecution. That never happens. The only people who get complete immunity out of the gate are people who are informants all along. That's who gets completed, and they disguise it as, oh, we just felt so pressured to do that because they came forward, did that hogwash. So they're definitely hiding something. There's something about the identity of these individuals and who they are and who they were working for that is embarrassing to the Justice Department. But they need their information. And so in order to convict everyone else of the seriousness of the conspiracy, but they need to hide who they are and what exactly they're about. And that's highly unusual, except for the historical pattern of when it's informants, infiltrators, assets of different kinds.
And it's just the harder the media pushes this, as though the audacity and the shamelessness that it takes to even mention this in the same sentence as 9/11 is confirms my opinion that the MSM is in fact the enemy of the people. But the idea they can even do that is shocking and suspicious. Like you say, okay, why are they trying to build this up so much? What is the practical purpose? And it slowly, like drip, 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 starts to come out. And you read these confessions or sentencing memoranda that they're forcing these literal grandmothers to draft in the hopes of getting some form of clemency. I don't know, favors from the court while sealing their own deal. What is it? Digging their own grave, basically, by admitting I did it was wrong. I didn't know that it was wrong, but I realized now it was wrong. I didn't realize that all this violence was going on, but I realized that now I contributed to it. It is effectively damning every Trump supporter who was there with only peaceful means. And it does seem, the more we go along, it does seem very suspicious as to who instigated this. And it's funny, not that we mentioned it at the time, but I think you did, Robert, and not to say you as in to point the blame, you as in to give the credit. And you mentioned the same thing in Whitmer. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, what's the latest in Whitmer? I did remember that one of the chief witnesses was determined to be the FBI informant who was then arrested on some other felony gun charge. What has there been any development in that?
No, just that it was fully outed. That basically the whole idea, they had some dimwit Keystone cops, these nitwit kids who were infiltrated by a federal informant who came up with the idea, took almost all the lead action, all the responsible action to try to actually manifest this crazy Keystone cop theory, conspiracy to kidnap the governor, and all these idiotic notions, things that never actually, and almost everything that was done as a act in furtherance of the conspiracy was done by the federal informant. And he outed himself. That made the government mad. And so they indicted him on some separate charges because they were mad that he didn't play ball and keep his mouth shut and play the game the right way. So they do this all the time. Every case I've ever had, I've found some informant buried in it, in somewhere in the unindicted co-conspirator list. Sometimes put in the indictment. Sometimes they try to leave them out. Like the other dumb thing some of these guys were saying, like, oh, the smart thing would be to not identify them in the indictment. Two big problems with that. One, they need the factual allegations of what these unindicted co-conspirators did to sexy up the case, to make the case of a conspiracy of any danger in the first place. So they can't leave them out, or they have to leave out key parts of the story. The second problem is when I was I am a defense lawyer. One of the first things any good defense lawyer does is you look through things that are missing in an indictment that should be there that aren't, or in a search warrant. I found a government informant right away in a search warrant because they thought my client didn't know something, so they left that information out because it would expose their informant, who, by the way, was the chief financial officer of the company, in a tax case. And he's setting things up to get his client, get his boss into trouble, to get himself out of separate trouble. Government does this all the time. But that's one of the first things I would do. So if I'm a defendant, and you have a bunch of information from George in there, but you leave George out, I'm going to be real suspicious. So instead what you do is you say, hey, he's an unindicted co-conspirator. We haven't got to him yet. We're going to get to him down the road. You try to cover up the fact that they were an informant all along. You can also be an informant and be a criminal conspirator, of course, at any stage. One of their games they like to play is, well, when he was doing the criminal aspects, he wasn't doing it on behalf of the government. It was later on that he was working for the government, or was in this other capacity he was working for the government.
He exceeded his work contract, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a massive effort to elicit false confessions from ordinary people who were not rioters, did nothing wrong. Those confessions will be used for Democrat propaganda. Hey, can't blame anybody for thinking that or for having that reflex now, because it's already happening in real time.
It came out that there's 14,000 hours of film collected, and they won't release hardly any of it to the public. Why? This is the worst event since 9/11. Shouldn't all of it be available for us to witness the horror of it? Or could it be because of what they found this week, which was the night before, a major guy instigating trouble and giving this idea at a local rally turns out to have been a Fed? So how many more of those are going to have? And by the way, let's say there were no informants involved in any of this, or no informants that were working for the government at the time. The other implication of this is just as damning, because it's that the feds knew all about this before it happened. How did it come about that they knew all this information of a unique threat and they reduced the level of security on January 6th? How did that happen? How is it that some of the film footage is showing other people entering that look like they're dressed in all black and don't look like Trump supporters who just showed up? How did that happen? How are there photos of cops opening the doors, opening security to make sure people could come in? Maybe that's the footage they're wanting to hide from everybody. There was, I talked about this in the first ever Hush Hush at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. What I did is I laid out, here's what you could probably see coming. It was an alternative theory, but that alternative theory keeps coming more and more and more true. And as you mentioned, only a stuck pig squeals, and the establishment's been squealing a lot this week.
As much as they were a year ago when another issue was the flavor of the day of opposition by the media, as much as they were 6 months ago when we're still living under the censorship of that incident. Now, Lil Panda Cub says, Viva, are they compounding felonies to make people plead guilty? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but Robert... Okay.
Of course, you throw in conspiracy charges because those are vague and obscure, and they can add all kinds of sentencing exposure to you. So that, yes, of course, that's what they're doing. They're making their lives miserable to try to get as many as possible to confess for the crime of being a Trump supporter. That's what probably 9 out of 10 of them are in there for. There's 1 out of 10 that did something stupid that day that warrants criminal consequences. 9 out of 10 did not. And they needed to exaggerate the significance and consequence of the event in order to support a political narrative that was going to basically criminalize 75 million people in America.
Now, I'm bringing this up. The second half is judgment. The first half could otherwise be an arguable fair point. Videos used in trial are sometimes withheld because of the need of getting a jury. This attorney has no clue to decide on. I think a great many people will disagree with the second part.
Two major problems with that theory. So one is the idea that video evidence could somehow contaminate the jury, and that's why they have to hide it from the rest of the world. Isn't body camera footage almost always demanded and released right away? How did that work in the Derek Chauvin case? Was Stephen objecting to the footage being released then? So were some of these other critics doing that? I don't remember that somehow. So that's why the government's doing it, because they're concerned about the impartiality of the jury in the Washington, D.C. jury pool, where there's a zero possibility of a fair jury. I don't think so.
If I look at people, I know who I saw on that response, Robert. I'm going to wholeheartedly agree with you, especially the idea that they're in Washington. There's no, the idea of tainting the jury pool. It might already be tainted even before any crime has taken place. And if there's 14,000 hours of footage, it's not all 14,000 hours that is going to be relevant to avoiding contaminating a potential jury pool when these people, by and large, tend to be pleading already. So I don't think that point holds water. And I think, but that's my personal opinion.
That's not a cowboy. That's actually a sculpture, Rodin, a mini version of Rodin's sculpture of the Thinker.
Beautiful. Now, do we have anything more on this, or do we move on to another issue of compounding felonies to coerce a settlement?
Yes.
Nothing more on Jan 6?
No, that covers it for now. But great shout out to Julie Kelly, Darren Beatty, Lee Smith, all of whom are doing great work on this and have stuck with their guns despite people. Especially what annoys me is all these legal establishment people coming so arrogantly, contemptuously, snobbishly, saying this is laughable, this is a joke, this is ridiculous. People who are, in some cases, overtly lying. In other cases, they're just not that skilled at what they think they're skilled at doing. None of them have my success rate, frankly. So, I'll respect a criminal defense lawyer who's won a lot of cases, who has an alternative theory, but you don't hear any of those people saying these things. It's the media lawyer types, the Dan Abrams of the world, who've never done a case in their lives, to my knowledge. Those are the people yipping and yaying, and they have a long history of being wrong. In fact, usually the louder they sound, the more likely that what they're objecting to is actually true.
Well, and we look, it was called in the Gretchen Whitmer. It came true, if only to a degree. So if anyone wants to argue as to whether or not it came totally true, the predictions, it came true. The only question is whether or not it was 100% accurate prediction, 50%, whether or not it was only one of the 6 criminals who was an undercover Fed, or whether or not it was 3 of the 6, whether or not it was the material 3 of the 6. It came to fruition to the point where people should, if they disagree with you, Robert, disagree with you, but they should be quiet and listen and then come to their own conclusions, because your track record on a few things has been impeccable because they were unlikely predictions at the time. But this revolt against anybody who suggests the obvious is itself obvious, which brings us
no doubt. I mean, Andy McCarthy started out by gaslighting everybody that James Comey was going to indict Hillary Clinton. That was my first interaction with him. And I kept saying, no. I was like, if they don't indict her by November, they sure aren't indicting her after she's the nominee. And he kept saying, no, I'm a federal prosecutor. I understand all these things. No, he doesn't. He's either, like I said, he's either an idiot or a liar. Either way, he's not trustworthy.